name is Karen Moline. I'm the Director of Membership and Communications at the Justice Research and Statistics Association. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar on ensuring the fidelity of offender risk assessment in large-scale correctional settings, the Quality Assurance Treatment Intervention Programs and Supervision Initiative, QA tips. It is part of a series of webinars hosted by JRSA to promote the sharing of information by and among the state statistical analysis centers and other justice-related agencies. Before we go any further, I want to thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for making this webinar possible. I also need to cover a few logistical items. We will be recording today's session for future playback. The link to the recording will be posted on the JRSA website under the Resources tab. Today's webinar is being audiocast via the speakers on your computer. If you do not have speakers or would prefer to use your phone, please use the number included in your registration email or on the Event tab located on the top left-hand side of the screen. There are many people joining us today, so we have automatically muted the phone lines of participants to reduce background noise. If you are not a presenter, please keep your phone muted. If you typed in *6 to unmute your phone, please retype it in to remute your phone. If you have questions for the presenters, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. If it's not showing up and you can see the chat bubble at the top of your screen, click on that and the chat feature will appear. Please select Host and Presenter from the drop-down menu next to the text box. If you would like to communicate with JRSA staff during the webinar, please submit your comment using the chat feature to Jason Trask or Karen Moline. This session is scheduled for 1 hour and 30 minutes and will end promptly at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you used to join the session initially. You can also call WebEx technical support at 1-866-569-3239. In the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, and this is very important, we will ask you to complete a short survey. The information you provide will help us to plan and improve future webinars and meet our reporting requirements. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Full bios for all of our speakers are on the WebEx information page for this webinar. Stephen M. Haas is the Director of the West Virginia Office of Research and Strategic Planning and Deputy Director of the Division of Justice and Community Services. The ORSP houses the Statistical Analysis Center and Justice Center for Evidence-Based Practices in West Virginia. He has a BA in Psychology and Political Science from The Ohio State University, and MS and PhD degrees in Criminal Justice from the University of Cincinnati. He has served as Principal Investigator and Project Director on several state and federally funded research projects and evaluations, and has published numerous research reports and academic papers on various topics in the field of criminology, education, and health and human services. His most recent work has centered on various issues related to the implementation of evidence-based practices, including the proper administration and use of offender risk and needs assessments, as well as the use of core correctional practices and motivational interviewing strategies by correctional personnel. His office is charged with the task of overseeing the statewide implementation of the Level of Service Case Management Inventory, the LSCMI, and developing a system of quality assurance across all justice agencies in the state. Leanne Davidson holds a BS in Criminal Justice and an MS in Law Enforcement and Administration from West Virginia State University. She is a research analyst for the West Virginia Office of Research and Strategic Planning, Justice Center for Evidence-Based Practice. Ms. Davidson is the coordinator for the Quality Assurance Treatment Intervention Programs and Supervision Initiative and monitors its implementation in the field. Leanne is a certified LSCMI and YLS-CMI trainer and conducts trainings for multiple justice agencies as part of West Virginia's statewide implementation of the LSCMI. She is co-investigator for LSCMI norming study on various correctional populations for the state of West Virginia. Leanne is an adjunct professor in the Criminal Justice Department at West Virginia State University. I'd like to ask Stephen Haas to start the presentation today. Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you. Steve Wormuth here.
Oh, Steve, you're there. Okay. Then I would like to introduce Steve Wormuth. He's the co-developer of the Level of Service Case Management Inventory, and he'll serve as our moderator and discussant for today's webinar. Dr. Wormuth received his PhD from the University of Ottawa. Previously, he was Psychologist-in-Chief with the formerly named Ministry of Correctional Services of Ontario. He is currently the Director of the Center for Forensic Behavioral Science and Justice Studies at the University of Saskatchewan, where he is also a professor. Dr. Wormuth, thank you so much for being here today. Take it away.
And it's great to be here. You know, there's just too many Steves on this panel this afternoon. I'm really delighted to have been asked to moderate the webinar this afternoon on the fidelity of risk assessment in large correctional organizations. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that quality assurance is essential to maintaining the predictive validity of any risk assessment instrument, and the various versions of the LSI are certainly no exception. For years in training, I'd like to use the Ferrari metaphor to illustrate this point. Bear with me for a moment. You can have the fastest high-performance vehicle in the world, but if the driver's not properly trained, or the machine is not properly tuned and maintained mechanically, you're just doomed to end up in the ditch, probably pretty quickly. And so it is with offender risk assessment instruments. About 20 years ago, Jim Bonda began talking about generations of risk assessment, with the original LSI being a risk/need tool, being in that third generation category. And then Jim, along with Don Andrews and I, began referring to fourth generation risk assessments, which differed from the previous versions. And they were defined in part by a set of procedures whereby the assessment was inextricably wrapped together with the offender case plan or an intervention strategy or a case management scheme. This component has equally important implications for fidelity and assurance. And simply, to carry the metaphor, if the assessment is not accurate or the assessment is not applied correctly, for example, in adherence to the R&R principles, the offender's rehabilitation plan will, suppose like the Ferrari, end up in the ditch. In the last decade, we have, and I think perhaps too slowly, become aware of the potential for such an outcome. But the evidence is mounting. A couple of early empirical examples of this kind of shortcoming come to my mind. One is, in fact, Jim Bonda's own review of the link between LSI assessment and probationers in Manitoba, where their case management planning. In his study, 39% of the identified criminogenic needs were not even addressed in the case plan, let alone in any kind of intervention. Closer to your own home, a second case is some wonderful research by Patricia Harris in Texas with the Wisconsin instrument, or the case management classification system. Again, she found no or only minimal compliance to a protocol in most cases was quite common. And even more importantly, when cases where and compliance was lacking, recidivism was actually higher, as measured by various mechanisms. So clearly, our first efforts, the old Nike solution, just do it, doesn't really work in corrections. There are simply not enough Michael Jordans to go around. So we need other approaches, conscientious, detailed procedures, as those being introduced by Stephen Haas and Leanne Davidson in West Virginia. So over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and welcome. I want to say welcome to everyone. I'm glad to have the opportunity to share, what we've done in West Virginia in terms of trying to assess quality on a large scale. there's a lot of challenges that come about when you try to think about how you're going to do this in a way that will, limit some resistance and at the same time get us measures that can be utilized to improve performance of staff in the field in terms of assessing and helping agencies also identify training needs. And our office also does training as well, and we use the data to identify areas where there might be additional training that's necessary. So I want to thank all of you for participating, but I want to emphasize, I guess, in this presentation that our approach here is, one of many approaches that could be utilized. As I go through this webinar, you'll see that we're describing essentially a peer-to-peer process with supervisory oversight. And this decision was made for specific reasons to go with this type of quality assurance mechanism. And I think it achieves a lot of the goals that we had in mind. So as I go through here, I think you'll get the details on exactly why we chose this and how it's worked thus far. What I'd like to do is just start with the overview here. We're going to go ahead and talk about what West Virginia's statewide implementation involved. We're a little bit unique in the sense that we are an agency, and my office is within an agency that is the state planning agency in justice. It's within the executive branch, and we have been charged through our Justice Center for Evidence-Based Practice to make sure that the statewide implementation went through properly, that we had good performance measures, good quality measures, those sorts of things. And we're a little bit unique because we're an outside agency and that we're setting policy and procedures for a whole host of agencies, including Juvenile Services, Division of Corrections, Parole, and our state day report centers. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the accuracy and the importance of accuracy in offender assessments. I think it goes without saying that we want to mention why it's so important. We're going to talk about the challenges of implementing on a large scale, and we're going to describe the peer-to-peer approach and West Virginia's basic approach for assessing quality. And we do this through a peer-to-peer type of quality assurance procedures that are also electronically submitted on a statewide scale. And then we take the data and we report that data back to agencies and key personnel so that they can then plan using that data. So we'll be talking about those things. Just as a brief introduction, this is who we are. I just wanted to mention that I'm the director of the Office of Research and Strategic Planning. Leanne Davidson works closely with me as a research analyst within the office. But we're comprised of two units, which you might find interesting out there. Most of you are probably familiar with criminal justice statistical analysis centers. These were funded many years ago through the Bureau of Justice Statistics and were established around the country in each of the states. But what we've added is what's called the Justice Center for Evidence-Based Practice. This is a state initiative. It was funded by the legislature in 2009 for the purposes of doing some of this work that we're talking about today, which is, ensuring that evidence-based practices are in fact implemented in the field. So if you look at the range of services that we provide, you can see that, generally we're focusing on evidence-based practices in multiple areas. But we also have services related specifically to the LSCMI, as well as other types of trainings, but the LSCMI. So our goals have always been to make sure that it gets implemented properly, that there's minimum standards for training and certification in place, that there's quality assurance procedures in place so that we can do ongoing monitoring and correct wherever we see problems. And also, we manage the online LSCMI online system. And this is another area where we're probably unique in the sense that all agencies in the state, executive agencies currently in the state, all enter into this online system. and this online system can be accessed by all of the different agencies and staff so that they can review and see LSCMI assessments on anybody that they're getting ready to serve, and really get a historical record on what the assessments have said in the past, as well as what services they've received. So you can see the types of things that we do. It's conducting training, setting policy, managing the online system, and we also conduct motivational interviewing user and trainer workshops because it's obviously a very important approach to interviewing in order to get valid assessments with the LSCMI. So over the years, we've been using the LSCMI in the state. We first implemented the LSCMI in 2006 in our day report centers across the state. The Division of Juvenile Services quickly followed in 2008. In 2010, DOC adopted the tool, really kind of on the heels of an early legislative initiative calling for a new program called accelerated parole in our state. So DOC began using the tool to assess people who would be eligible for accelerated parole. Parole followed the institutions in terms of getting trained, and probation and drug courts are also utilizing the tool. So this is very good in the sense that we have really all sectors of the justice system using the LSCMI to inform their decisions from the beginning to the end of the system. And a key part of this has been, and one of the reasons why we feel like the LSCMI is so important is we feel it helps us sort of solve this notion of the sorting issue. We currently have the Justice Reinvestment Initiative undergoing in our state through the Council of State Governments and collaboration with others. And, you know, one of the things that they had pointed out, which is something that we've noticed over the years with some of our population forecasting and other things that we do, is that oftentimes we were not getting the right people in the right levels of supervision and not getting them the right services. And we've had a few studies that have shown that in the state, and then the Justice Reinvestment Initiative sort of reiterated the importance of that. So we think that the LSCMI helps us in that regard with getting the people in the right services and in the right level of supervision. All of you on this phone, I'm going to assume that most people on this phone, obviously on this phone call, obviously know that you know what the purpose of risk and needs assessments are and why they're so important. So I'm just going to say this, is that one thing that we have to recognize is that assessment and offender risk assessments in particular are a very important first step towards achieving evidence-based practices and effective interventions. If we're not assessing properly, then we're not likely making subsequent decisions that are in tune with what the offender actually needs in terms of supervision and treatment. So, and many people view this as being the first step. We've got to get an ample and proper assessment done on people coming into the system and moving out into reentry and parole and so forth. Obviously, accuracy is critical. It does us no good to, you know, assess offenders and have error associated with those assessments. You know, if we falsely score people too high, you know, there's consequences to that. If we falsely score people too low, there's additional consequences on the other side to that. You see some of those listed there, but, you know, generally speaking, scoring too high or scoring too low violates the risk principle, which we know is very important for achieving effective correctional interventions. And, you know, not scoring it correctly is going to impact our ability to really influence recidivism, could jeopardize public safety, could waste resources. So it's very important, and we knew that from the get-go, extremely important that we needed to make sure that the assessments were being done as good as they could be done in the natural environment, okay? So we know, and James Bonta did, has articulated this quite well. We know that the research kind of tells us that small-scale demonstration projects that are related to the R&R principles tend to show greater effect sizes than, in terms of reductions in recidivism, than when we go to apply these same R&R principles in sort of the natural environment in large correctional context and so forth. And in 2013, Jim Bonta and his colleagues wrote an article for the JRSA's journal, Justice Research and Policy, that spoke very clearly to this notion that because we're seeing this reduction in effect sizes as we move from these demonstration projects that are small scale to these larger contexts, sort of in that natural correctional setting, we see that reduction in effect size, that it probably has something to do with the implementation itself, not necessarily the principles or the treatments or the theory behind it, but in fact, it's probably linked to quality of implementation. So when we see the reductions in effect sizes, there's enough evidence to suggest that implementation is playing a role in that. So what are some of the challenges that we faced in thinking about the statewide implementation? First off, there's multiple agencies and hundreds of users. So I had to take into consideration that, this is something that's beyond direct observation, and there wouldn't be, and we weren't going to be given resources of a number of quality assurance monitors throughout the state. So we had to kind of use some existing staff in order to make this happen. We've developed a very strong, cohesive network of trainers. Our office here trains trainers, and then the trainers go out and train users, sort of a standard, T for T type of approach. And we utilize those trainers essentially in a similar way as what we've heard in the literature as communities of practice. This notion that, we have groups of people who kind of serve as the champions and the people articulating the vision and the goals. So we use our trainers for those, and in some cases, and in most cases, key mid-level managers as well in those different organizations to do this. We also do direct observation, when possible. A lot of the direct observation is done, and you'll hear an example from Leanne Davidson a little bit later in this presentation, where she talked about, she's going to talk about a success story where the Division of Corrections, for instance, was able to use some of the data that was being provided back to them to identify potential problem areas, and then they went out and did some direct observations, did some case file reviews, and were able to solve that problem. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're an external agency. I already mentioned that. So we're kind of an external agency. We're working across multiple agencies. So it's important to develop a method that did not overreach in terms of our, day-to-day involvement in operations of these facilities and those sorts of things. We wanted to do something that could be managed in-house. We set the framework, set the standards, help monitor and get it going and monitor over time, but we wanted to recognize that the agencies themselves had to have a vital role in this. And lastly, I would assume most of you, if you've worked in this area for long, have probably heard the phrase roll with resistance from time to time. You got to recognize anytime you're implementing something new, you're going to have some resistance among staff, maybe sometimes administrators and others. It's important then to recognize that resistance could exist. So we also tried to develop a strategy that we thought would create buy-in from some of the lowest levels all the way up to administration. So that was some of our thoughts in developing our strategy. As I said right at the beginning, I want to recognize that there are multiple valid methods for monitoring assessment quality out there. There's sort of a give and take with whatever you choose in terms of how you're going to monitor. You can, some of you are probably familiar with the assessment checklists or matrices that can be applied. and you can take some random case file reviews. You can also get taped interviews and videos to do critiques. There's all sorts of approaches out there for assessing quality in this area, but there's gives and takes to whatever you choose. Some are more resource intensive, some require more time, others are kind of diffuse responsibilities a little bit and sort of lessen the amount of work on small numbers of individuals and so forth. So you got to take that in consideration. So what we did is we developed a peer-to-peer approach with supervisory oversight, as you see on the slide. You know, it was intended to be bottom-up rather than top-down. While we have administrative support, and while, you know, obviously my office and others who maybe are in administrative capacities have a sort of a heavy hand in this, we wanted an approach, though, that really created what we call a culture of quality or learning. We wanted the people who are doing the assessments to understand and feel some responsibility for the quality of these assessments. This concern was quite frankly very magnified when we went with the LSCMI online system. Again, these are assessments coming in from multiple agencies throughout the state. You know, so if we had people who were insufficiently trained in one agency and they were submitting those assessments to the same system, we could have bad data and people could be making decisions based off those prior assessments for informing their decisions working with the offender presently and those sorts of things. So what we wanted to do was create sort of a standardized processes where all agencies were going through the same processes, had the same requirements for training and other things, so that we could, you know, create that level of standardization, but also kind of create a culture of quality and learning so that people felt invested in the process. Our approach also obviously was designed to minimize resistance, try to create that ownership and the importance of these assessments. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview here of the sort of the infrastructure of how we set this up. Then Leanne Davidson is going to go through some of the basics regarding collection and reporting, and then we'll go from there. So from sort of a bird's eye view, our infrastructure is based on the development of statewide policies and procedures and data collection. So we kind of thought, okay, how are we going to do this on a statewide level? We need to create a successful infrastructure. You know, if you've done these kinds of things before, you know that it has to start with some level of policy to say, these are the things we think need to be in place so that people have clear guidance on what's expected of them. So we did that. Our goal in this was to basically create a level of confidence among all decision makers that the results are accurate, assessors are qualified, and ample oversight is in place. With any kind of initiative, for instance, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which we are currently working through now, it takes judges, for instance, to feel comfortable being able to make some decisions based off of these assessments and kind of know that these assessments are valuable and accurate and they've been done properly. Same thing on the back end. The Division of Corrections uses the LSCMI to inform the parole decision-making process. Very important that, that people who are sitting on that parole board feels very confident that the LSCMI was done properly and proper collateral information was used and all of these sorts of things. If you don't get that, then you get people being very conservative in their decision-making and maybe also placing people in areas of maybe traditional punishments which they may or may not need, or too intensive levels of supervision that they may or may not need, and you begin to violate the R&R principles which we're all trying to adhere to. So we developed a series of quality checks we're going to be talking about today. We also developed certification and recertification standards. We developed an electronic system for monitoring and reporting, and we also developed some methods for sharing the LSCMI information, primarily and really, well, I guess I should say just basically the LSCMI online system serves this function for us. So first things first, we developed some minimum standards. Now, they're minimum standards in the sense that we're saying, you know, this is what we want to have done as a minimum. You can do more. You can take the information that we report back to you, identify areas of need, and do more training, do more oversight, do some of your own quality checks, do pulling case files, or however you want to do that. But we set just simple minimum standards. And these standards do not apply to just one agency. They apply to all of the agencies under the executive branch. And you can see those policies there. So the first thing I want to say is it all starts with policy. So in order for that to be successful, you have to develop some sort of user trainer certification policies, right? What I'm presenting to you now, and I hope all of you can see that well, but what I'm presenting to you now is just a summary table of our requirements for minimum certification on the LSCMI. These are for user minimum requirements and user trainer minimum requirements. So if you see this, if you look at the first column, you see the different areas that we're requiring in terms of prerequisites and certification. The second column is the user minimum requirements, and then the third column is the user trainer minimum requirements. Now, these requirements go beyond the minimum requirements set by multi-health systems in terms of the distribution of this tool. And you know, there's a reason for that, as multi-health systems has encouraged states to sort of develop what is needed in order to maintain quality on their own. And multi-health systems is not in the business of setting state policies. So what they do is just simply set minimum requirements in relation to the tool. We set minimum quality requirements in relation to the agencies that we're responsible for administering and making sure that the tool is used properly. So just a few highlights here, because, you know, it is kind of detailed. And again, a lot of these things will be posted as well on the JRSA site, so you'll be able to look at these kinds of things. But give you a good example, I mean, we have prerequisites. The prerequisites, we have both required and preferred for the trainers, because we're trying to provide guidance for what we'd like to see, but at the same time, we have our requirements set at certain standards. Our requirements exceed multi-health systems. None of them go below multi-health systems. But a few things that I think are worth highlighting here, and maybe I'll just use the user trainer column at this point because it's the most intensive. But we have people go through the training that's required by multi-health systems. Trainers have to be certified by a master trainer. I'm a master trainer on the LSCMI, and in this office, I basically work with the trainers to make sure that the trainers are prepared to go out and train others. As you know, if you're familiar with multi-health systems requirements, there is a test at the end in terms of the content test, and you have to score an 85% or greater. As part of the user requirements, you have to do a rating test. That's already been completed by the time you're being selected as a trainer, so we accept that as a score. From the standpoint of motivational interviewing, we ask users to submit one motivational interview to be scored to their user trainers. And the purpose of this is to see if people are actually conducting interviews proficiently. And then also for trainers, we ask them to submit two, one for the user and then one for the trainer. And they get feedback. So if you're a trainer, you'd get feedback from our office here, and we would provide feedback, and we use the Mighty for scoring. So we score those interviews out, give give feedback. The purpose is really just to give feedback on what they can improve and see if they're reasonably proficient. Lastly, we ask them to demonstrate their ability to use the online system, because we do use the LCMI online system by Multi-Health Systems. And they typically can demonstrate this through the training itself, because we ask them to submit an assessment online during the training. And then lastly, we also ask for our trainers, when they are originally certified as trainers, to submit 2 modules of them teaching and or have direct observation. Our office does it in a couple of ways. One is we have had people to submit videotapes of them doing a training and 2 modules from that training, and we've scored it and provided feedback. But oftentimes the ORSP staff, and specifically the JCEVP staff, go out and they do direct observations of the trainings when they're offered by the trainers. So that is the nuts and bolts of the certification. But we also have what's called a recertification process. Just quickly, I want to show this. For this one here, the table looks very similar, as you can see, and I can maybe expand that out a little bit. I think maybe it'll expand on your end too, so you can see it a little bit better. How about that? Here you see a recertification table. It looks very similar, but you can see up here where it says recertification. Basically, we're asking people who are trainers to come back once a year. We like to see our trainings at least once a year. It offers, we have basically a recertification training agenda. It involves further practice. It involves practicing the quality assurance procedures. It also involves reading new research articles or materials that would help them in their lectures and in their trainings themselves. And we also use that time to discuss any issues that came up over the course of the year and the results of the quality assurance monitoring. What were we seeing? What seems to be common themes in terms of issues and problems and so forth. So if you look at this table, you've got a number of things that we ask. We do ask that they submit a videotape as well for the recertification workshop, because we want to, again, assess motivational interviewing during this phase. But so that's just sort of an overview, and this is the overview table of that, but you can see that. So in a nutshell then, quality assurance begins with having the proper policies in place regarding training. Difficult to get good assessments if they haven't been trained properly, and as we know, training is not a one-shot deal. Multiple trainings are often needed, and that's why we have recertification trainings in place. All right, so with that said, QA tips. This is where Leanne's going to begin talking here in the next couple slides, but here's the overview for the rest of this seminar. Is under QA tips, we measure 4 central themes, and here's what they are. We measure the quality of the instrument completion. Essentially, this relates to things like iterator reliability. We want to know where are the discrepancies between reviewers, and so that they can inform future training. It can also give us some sense of how well and how consistent these tools are being, the LCMI is being applied. Second, we look at the quality of the case management plan. This is focusing mainly on the congruence between the assessment and what the assessment results say and the case plans being developed. And then the third area is obviously the proficiency in the use of motivational interviewing is assessed. And then the fourth is relationship skills. Leanne will explain this, but once a year we do ask that supervisors review their subordinates with their annual employee appraisals on relationship skills, which is deeply rooted in the core correctional practice, literature, and measures, okay? All right, so one of the things that we try to do in these 4 areas is we try to measure quality, not just quantity. I'm sure many of you who've spent time, thinking about performance measurements and how best to do that, sort of have heard this discussion about, are we counting beans or are we counting relevant practices? Well, most of you know that an evidence-based practice in our field is to measure things that are relevant and then provide people with feedback on those things. And that's what we've tried to do here. Relevance for us is not always how many assessments are completed, but how well those assessments are completed. And that's the quality issue. So if you look here, I got an example, just to give a couple examples, but I'll give you one here you can see on the slide, is, quantity would be the percentage of clients that received an LSCMI assessment. That is an okay performance measure to say, are people doing them? But it doesn't rise to the level to say it's really getting us down to the quality level and saying, well, those assessments of quality. So what we have done with our QA tips is go one step further and say, essentially, of all the LSCMI assessments that were done, to what extent was there agreement among reviewers? To what extent is there quality there? So that gives you an example of what we tried to do here. So I'm going to turn this over, I believe, at this point, to Leanne Davidson. She's going to kind of take it from here to talk a little bit about the policies and procedures, and she's going to walk you through the forms themselves that are submitted electronically, as well as how we report those results back. So, Leanne?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to just kind of briefly discuss a little bit of what Dr. Hoss has already talked about, the QA tips and our policies and procedures. And they are really centered on a peer-to-peer approach with supervisory oversight. So the way that it's kind of what we train in our training course is that the people within the facilities, they get together and they provide immediate feedback to each other, and they're trained by our office as well as the other trainers that are trained by our office, and we try to get that focus on what are we doing, and we identify what services are needed for the offenders, as well as whether or not there's any training gaps. Now, we do this twice a year, and each time they're due on June the 30th and then on December 31st. And each LSCMI user is required to do this, and they're submitted to our office. They don't have to mail it in or anything. It's just completely electronically provided to us, and we can pull that information. Now, the relationship skills, which are the supervisors, they complete those only once a year, and we usually have them do that December so they can look at the whole entire year. But we wanted to do it from a peer-to-peer perspective because we didn't want all the users to feel like that not only were that their supervisors were kind of watching everything, but that, sometimes coming from a colleague, you can learn something that you may be doing wrong and understand it a little better than if it's coming from your supervisor. So this was a kind of an approach that we decided would be the best way to go about handling this information. So one of the ways that we have told them, and this is the way we actually train it in our training course, is that a reviewed user gathers the collateral information prior to even scheduling an interview. So they've already looked at whether another LSCMI assessment has been completed. They look at the NCIC report or the III report or anything that's in the file, and they gather that information, and then they get with another reviewed user, and they can sit in on the interview together. So one person is conducting the interview, the other person is actually sitting there with them, or the interview could be recorded and the other person can listen to the recording at another time. Once the interview has already taken place, then the reviewer and the reviewed user separately go into separate rooms and they score the assessment. So once they've completed their score, they come back together and they have a discussion to see if there's any discrepancies in the score, and if there are, where the discrepancies occurred. Now, we do get questions a lot of times provided to our office where they can't meet a mutual agreement on whether or not one was right or one was wrong. So our office kind of does have that oversight if, we try to help them find a mutual, come to a mutual agreement on whose score was the correct score. And if our office, if we're not available, then we have a trainer available at almost every facility who they have contact information for that they can notify to try to help them resolve whether or not a discrepancy actually did occur, and then they can come with a mutual decision on a score. Now, the mutually agreed upon score is the one that actually gets put into our database. The other two are just used for the peer-to-peer sections that's actually reported to our office. So the official assessment is the agreed upon score. So that's the one that the offender would actually utilize for programming purposes, and the other one is just used to our office so that we can do some quality assurance on maybe some better training on that area, or maybe cover that area a little more in depth when we go through the LSTMI training. So then once they have the agreed upon score, then they share that information. The normative feedback is actually given to the offender at that time, and they create a case plan based off of the agreed upon assessment. Now, once the case plan and the assessment is actually agreed upon, then they do a case management review, and the case management review will be based upon the case plan that was created, and then they determine what was the best, whether or not that was the best way to go for that offender. And then they also look at when they were...
Two aren't showing up.
Oh, okay. And the other part is the motivational interview. They look at whether or not the interviewer was using the active listening skills. Were they using open-ended questions? Were they getting enough information from that interview to do an accurate assessment and to do an accurate case plan? Because motivational interviewing, we do touch on when we do our LSTMI training, and that's very important because the more open-ended questions and affirmations, reflections that we use during an interview, the more information we can actually get from an offender, and we're building that rapport, which is very important when we're doing an LSTMI assessment. So after those are completed, the reviewer submits all of those forms into our office through Survey Gizmo. That's what we use right now. And I can collect that data at the end of the year. And then I analyze the data, I create a report, and then that is sent to the individual facilities. And I also create a report that's based on an entire agency. So not only do I do reports for individual facilities, but I do it based on the entire agency as well. So when I send back the feedback, I give each facility 2 reports. And I also do a comparative report that they can look at to see where they stand from an agency basis.
Very good.
Now, getting into the actual forms that we use, and one of the things that we look at is the assessment review. We look at that inter-rater reliability, and we try to determine whether or not there was a discrepancy within a score, which actually helps us build a consensus, and we can determine which area may need more training. Now, when we look at the inter-rater reliability, the reviewed user is reporting on the reviewer is reporting on the reviewed user's score. So not only are we looking at, when we report this back, we give them the exact number that the discrepancy occurred. So not only do we look at the section, but we also look at, what number the question was on the LSTMI assessment. We give the direct score, and this information, and then if there was any notes, there's a place on there where they can put notes. So all of that is included on the report that we give back to them. And this allows us to determine, you know, when we're doing reporting for other research, whether or not we have access to all of this information. Now, sometimes what we are finding is that, you know, when this person actually conducted the interview, they may not have had all of the information at that time. And then that would be one of the things that we would take into consideration for our report. Okay. So now what I want to do is actually, I created a video, and I want to actually walk you through the video, which I thought would be the easiest way for you to get an understanding of what we. Now, what you can do is if you look on your screen, there is an expanding arrow over here that will allow you to make your screen full so that you can better see the video. The quality on this was not as good as I would have liked, but I can at least walk you through the actual information. But the surveys are actually loaded onto our website, and when the users come through, they can just click on the link for the survey, and it takes them directly to the survey. So there's no login, there's no information that they have to do. So on this page, it's just they're giving us their information, their name, their email address, and which agency they're with, and what facilities they're with. And then they click next. So on this one, we're looking at the user, what their name is, what their email address is, which facility they are with, and the facility name, because we do have users that are in different facilities that are reviewing each other. Then what we do is we're looking at the date. We're looking at the date of the intake, the date of the LSCMI, and the date that the interview is taking place, and then you click next. Now on this screen, this is one of the screens that what we're looking at. This is what kind of interview this was. Was it an initial LSCMI? Was it a reassessment? Or was it a discharge summary? And that's important because that's the information that we do give back to the facility so that they know which one, which type is being assessed more on the quality. And then on this page also, we look at what was gathered, what collateral information was gathered in the beginning for them to do the peer-to-peer. Was all of the collateral that was available to them utilized? Sometimes we find that it's not. So that's an important thing that we need to cover in training is to make sure that all the collateral information that is available is looked at. Then you just you click next. Now here is where the discrepancy occurs. Once each user and reviewed user has completed their scores, then they will put this information in here. And then it'll ask, did a discrepancy occur in the use of an override? If so, then they would click yes. If not, they would click no. Now, based on this, we have scores that are different here in the companion area. So when we click next here, it brings up this screen here. Were there any discrepancies? Yes, there was. It occurred in Section 1, and it occurred. Here we give an example to show them exactly how to fill out the form, and another example so that they can have exactly how to complete it. And then we put what section, what number the question occurred, what the reviewer's rating was, and what the reviewed user's rating was. And then we put a reason. So for this particular discrepancy, the reviewed user was not really certain about whether or not the companions they had were to be considered criminal friends. So that's a discrepancy. One of those things was when we sat and talked, you know, that could have been resolved, and then the official thing was put in, and then that would have been the official assessment that was placed. Now, if other discrepancies would have occurred on that, they would have completed this section, but if there were no other ones, then you would just go down here and click next at the bottom. And then on this section, we just ask that each reviewer type their name, the reviewed user's name, and the date that the feedback was given, and then we have them check that box below that's just certifying that they completed that assessment to the best of their ability and with all honesty. and the supervisor did sign off on it, because it's very important for them to do it as honest as possible. And then this screen here, it gives you a snapshot of the entire form before you actually submit it to our office in case something needs to be revised. But then a lot of the agencies will ask the users to print that out so that they can put that into their employee file or their personnel file. And so then at the bottom, after they look to make sure that everything is complete, then they can click submit. So that is the assessment review form, and that, like I said, is based solely on the LSTMI assessment itself. So the next form that we actually have them do is the case management review. And like I said earlier when I was talking about how they get together, this can be completed on one offender. So they can do the interview together, they can, the case management plan will be done, and this can all be done on the same offender. So what our case management review form looks at, it assesses the quality of the case plan. Were the top criminogenic needs that were discovered on the LSTMI assessment, were those placed at the top for the case management plan? Was the court order, anything that was in that court order, was that completed and put into the case management plan? So we want to make sure that the case management plan is complete and that it does actually reflect the assessment, so that we want to make sure that the R&R is actually being met and that this offender can get the correct programming that is needed. So I'm going to just walk you through that. I've done another video for that one. So again, right here's that arrow. If you just want to click onto that, that will help make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so again, that was also loaded on our website, and you click straight into it. It takes you straight to the case management form. Same information is gathered at the beginning, and the reason why we gather this at the beginning is I can sort this when I do my report by facility, and that way I can make sure that I'm including all the users for that facility at the beginning. Also, this is for the reviewed user, and we also report this to the facilities because they want to make sure that all of their users are actually submitting these forms. So when I get an email from a supervisor that asks me if this user completed their forms, I can go straight to this screen on my reporting side, and I can let the supervisor know whether or not they actually did complete their quality assurance. Now, on this screen, again, it looks for what type of interview was completed and were all sections complete. Then, after that, it says, was an override utilized? And then you go to next. And then what we look at here is, were the criminogenic needs actually utilized? And we use a Likert scale here, 1 being completely disagree, all the way to 6 being completely agree. And what we look at is, you know, whether or not the problems were prioritized correctly. Was there a specific goal put into place? And then after they actually score these, they can put notes here, which is a recommendation for improvement, so that the reviewed user would know whether or not there's an area they need to improve on. And then we actually have them calculate an average of this particular section. So then after that is completed, you would go to next, and then it looks at the non-criminogenic needs. Were there any non-criminogenic needs that needed to be addressed? If so, how well? And were there specific goals given for that one as well? And then again, we place a box there for improvement, and then you go to next. Then we look at the special responsivity. Was there any? If so, how well was it addressed? And then we give improvement, and then click next for that. Now, then once we get to this screen, we look at the overall case plan. How well was that case plan? And did it look at all the R&R and focus on that for situations? Did they, if they did, you can even give them a good recommendation here for any improvement, but also let them know that they're doing a good job. I mean, that's why we put that information there. They can make notes on that. Then once everything is scored, you can go here and it'll add up your average scores here, and we put that there. And then we also give another box for feedback, just for the, if you want to include any other information, just to give them a good job or anything like that. And then again, we also include this so that every time they do a form, they can make sure that they check that and that the supervisor has looked at everything before it's submitted, and then they click submit. And we have that happen every time because we want them to be able to look at everything before it's submitted to our office and also have an opportunity to print it out so that they can have it for future references.
Maybe just forms for the next two and the videos.
So one of the other things that we actually look at is the quality assurance, and in the quality assurance is the motivational interviewing skills. And what we kind of look at here is we look at the motivational interviewing spirit. You know, did they ask permission before giving any advice? Did they, stay away from, telling people what to do? And we just look at to make sure that, the things that were acknowledged that were important, that they use the active listening skills. Did they engage in a change talk? Did they ask them where they see themselves in the future? These are things that are important, and it helps build rapport with the offender so that we can make sure that all the information that we gather is very accurate as well as honest, because one of the things that is very important is the honesty. If we don't have the honesty, then our quality assurance is not really going, the only way we can go, if everybody's just giving everybody sixes and we have these perfect scores, the only way we can go is down. So there's no room for improvement, which when somebody actually does start to be honest, it doesn't look like we're doing a very good job. So, so basically what the supervisor annual review assessment is, it is a report that's completed annually that focuses on whether or not these things were conducted with honesty and integrity. So, and basically our supervisor annual skill is rooted in the core correctional practice areas. So it looks at, what are the authority, was there reinforcement skills? What were the authority skills? Did they have any problem solving? Did they have a good communication with the offender? Did they have like a firm but fair approach? Do they recognize and affirm a client's positive behavior? Sometimes just a little good job, way to go, that's great, goes a long way. I know with a lot of our agencies, we don't have a lot of resources to give rewards, but sometimes praise goes a long way, and sometimes we forget about that. So we just look at those skills, and the supervisor looks at those skills for the subordinate, and then they submit that information to us as well. And that way it helps us develop whether or not these things are being utilized. Now, the supervisors don't have to necessarily be a supervisor in the facility. They just have to be an LSCMI user who has been actually put into that role and completes this form once a year and sends that into our office. Now, when we actually get all this information, so in a few weeks I'll be actually downloading all of these QA forms that are being submitted to our office right now. And once I get all that, I kind of sat and figured out what areas I want to focus on, and I've created a standardized measure that allows me to look at the way that agencies have been performing over the past year, or I can do it over the past 6 months, and I will be able to show them basically where they are now and where they were a year ago. And it'll actually provide them statistics for each individual facility based on their entire agency as well as just the facility itself. But I can even, if a supervisor contacts me and asks me for an individual user's performance, I can also give them that information as well and provide them the same statistics based on a user's performance as I could the entire facility's performance. So I do keep that information so that we can report that if they need to see that. And I wanted to just briefly show you, because I know we're kind of running short on time here, for the, I wanted to show you just one of the reports. And this is what one of the reports looks like that I actually provide. And this is for our Department of Corrections. And, you know, I show them, you know, what type of interview was used. So for this, 60% of the quality assurance peer-to-peer was used on reassessment LSDMIs instead of initials. So I can break that down for them, and I break it down by individual count as well as percent. Then I look at, did all the reviewed users examine their collateral information? Well, for the instance on this one, 1.5% did not utilize all their collateral information, but 98% did. Then I break it down onto each individual level. The collateral sources, we look at what sources were being used, their criminal history, pre-sentence investigation, correctional institutional records. You can see those are some of the primary things that are utilized among the Department of Corrections. Then I start to break it down by the number of assessments that were performed that used that source, and then we base it from a percentage on the overall level. These are other sources used that we put an other feature there as well because it may not be listed, so we want to see what one facility may have access to that we can also reach out to other facilities to look for. So then once we get there, we look at just diagnostic sources, if there were specialized assessments conducted. And then here's one of the main things we look at. Was all the sections completed? Based on this, 100% of the DOC completed all of their sections, which is great. So then we start breaking down the discrepancies. If no, you know, what sections weren't completed, and then we start breaking down into the individual things. So did a discrepancy occur in the use of an override? Some there were, not that many because, you know, we try to reduce the amount of overrides we utilize anyway, so we try. I'm glad to see that count was very low. And then we start to get into the discrepancies on the scoring. So based on the assessments that were turned in for our peer-to-peer quality assurance, there were 22% of the reviewed assessments, a discrepancy occurred. So we have the count of the actual ones, and then we can look at which section it actually, section 1 was the big one, which is, you know, our, that's where we get our score from. So section 1, that's our general risk and need factors. And then we break it down by each individual question here. So for this purpose, you know, one of the big ones was companions. We had a big discrepancy in companions here. And one of the other ones was the pro-criminal attitude and orientation. That can be, you know, a matter of personal opinion on those things about how an offender felt. Maybe one offender during the interview may have. So that's why we do this, because we want to be able to discuss this with our colleagues, because sometimes, you know, one colleague may have caught on to some body language that another colleague did not catch on to. So that's why when we go through these trainings, we tell them, you know, before you score anything in the system, you know, if you're not sure about something, you know, call our office or, you know, talk to one of the colleagues that's in your agency. So based on this information that we have actually provided back to them, as well as our policies that we've used, like we had, Dr. Haas had earlier talked about, we've set minimum standards, and our Department of Correction actually went an extra mile. So this is kind of giving us a little bit of evidence that our peer-to-peer process is actually working. So one of the success stories I just want to touch on a little bit is, we provide feedback to our Department of Corrections, our day report centers, and all of the facilities that we do oversee. And based on our feedback and the policies implemented, which is the reassessment policies and recertification policies and stuff that we've actually discussed earlier, the DOC kind of discovered some discrepancies within their assessments among facilities and users. So what they did was they kind of got together and they decided to send a couple of their LSMI trainers to do a direct observation over some of the LSMI users. They kind of sat in on a few assessments, kind of done a score like while they did a score, they actually done another score, kind of revealed that there were certain discrepancies occurring at certain facilities, and what they decided to do at that point was to mandate an additional policy directive and to conduct some additional training within that facility, because what they discovered was that, one individual had been training other people to do things a certain way, and based on the peer-to-peer review, that was able to be kind of discovered and corrected. So that is one way that we have discovered that our peer-to-peer process is actually working. It did create some additional training, but the good thing about that is now everybody's back on board with how things are supposed to be performed, as well as make sure that it's done accurately.
Okay. So, that was a great summary of just how we collect the data and how it gets reported back. I think just to add to her success story, I would say that that it really achieved what we really wanted to have done, which is it sort of created this culture of quality. And some of these trainers in DOC, after and some of the administrators, after seeing our data, seeing some of the issues and so forth, took it upon themselves to go the extra mile, I suppose, to do the direct observations that were necessary to correct things. So in a way, it created that culture that we were looking for, having people work together to produce quality assessments. And I also want to just point out the fact that, we do have supervisory oversight and in terms of these processes. So we have, sort of checks and balances in place to make sure that the people who are doing the peer-to-peer, are not using the same reviewer every time. And DOC, and as just an example, DOC has set up processes where supervisors actually choose the reviewers each time, not the employee themselves, so that people are being reviewed by different people each time, and that way they're getting different perspectives and different feedback. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over. We started about 10 minutes late on this webinar, so by my measure, unless Jason or Karen is going to suggest otherwise, I think we have about 20 more minutes on this webinar, and I think Dr. Warmoth has some closing comments he may want to make, and he also will help facilitate the questioning and answering session. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen and Leanne. Tremendous presentation. I'm so impressed with the work you're doing there in West Virginia. Just off the top, there are a couple of words that come immediately to mind with your presentation and the work you're doing. One is systematic. This is so systematic, the way you've gone about structuring your quality assurance mechanism, doing the data checks, reliability, follow-up, feedback. I don't want to sound patronizing, but this is tremendous, tremendous work. Organizations throughout North America and beyond follow your lead. The second thought, the concept that comes to mind is, that old saying about, the devil is in the details. And in order to root out the devil, I mean, you go into a tremendous amount of detail here in your work to ensure that the instrument is being applied, is being administered first, in the most accurate and precise manner possible, and secondly, the follow-up work rolling on from the assessment is consistent with the assessment results. I mean, two key steps here in the application of risk assessment to correctional practice. I'm also reminded, I mean, way back when the LSCMI first began, actually with a pilot version, former graduate student of mine, Lena Gerard, did a follow-up review of the first 600 LSCMIs that were done in Ontario and found a 20% error rate in those assessments, and that was just based on a review of the assessment protocol and the documentation, not even with access to the interview. So it's an ongoing issue, and I mean, tremendous on your part to get into those details. So yes, the devil's in the details, and I'm reminded of that song, isn't it? I think something like the devil went down to Georgia. Well, good thing he went to Georgia and not West Virginia, because you guys would have him rooted out and sent packing.
No, we don't allow devils here. We find, yeah, okay.
I also see some inquiries here, sure, about the materials that I know we'd all be eager to have access to, both the slide set, the PowerPoint, and the webinar. I understand, Jason and Karen, that JRSA will be posting the information.
Yes, the webinar will be posted. All the PowerPoint slides and the videos that some people were not able to see will be posted on our website probably by tomorrow, I think, or Monday, and under the resources tab of the JRSA website.
That's tremendous. I know I'll be referring a number of my colleagues to your site in the near future. If we do have some time for questions, let me exercise my prerogative and start off with something like the following. I'm really interested in this, the peer-to-peer with oversight model, if I might call it that. I've seen various efforts, to implement quality assurance, typically more of an audit kind of function or a random check periodically, by a supervisor, but not this particular approach. I'm quite interested in it. So if there's anything more you might add, tremendous. How you went about implementing it, and I'm also thinking in I guess as a corollary to that question, if there are any administrators, I mean, listening in, I suspect they might be thinking, oh, tremendous, but what are the costs, to get into this detail of repeating assessments or doing parallel assessments? I mean, administrators might find this a daunting protocol to follow.
Okay. Okay, so those are both very good points. What I would say to this is, as I've said, is there are many different types of approaches that are valid. And we would never suggest that this approach by itself, without following up and using the data to go do direct observations and do some case file reviews and things like this, isn't necessary. That it's not necessary if you have this. But what we would say is this helps us manage the scope. And it also meets the goals of getting people active, so that it's not just administrators who care about quality, but the staff themselves. And it's repeated so that once every 6 months, they have to at least pay attention to quality. And it just sort of gets reinforced over time. And once they've realized that that no one is going to be really punished for some of these things. We're not at the stage of punishment. We're really about providing information about quality and then having people work together to solve those. The supervisors do play an important role in this, that they need to, have some oversight to make sure that the peer-to-peer process was done legitimately and that sort of thing as part of this. Some of the things that we've done, with this, obviously, is we've encouraged, we've shown you sort of a glimpse into a lot of this, but in our policies, we do talk about alternating, assessors, and reviewers, and sort of keeping those kinds of checks in place. We've talked about using the ORSP if there's questions they have or are not able to, come to resolution on some of this stuff. So I think we've, put a lot of things in place that, encourage people to, follow the procedures pretty closely. Now, to your second point about cost and time and so forth, really, to be quite honest with you, our choice was between, if we wanted to get on such a large scale quality processes in place, it would really require the hiring of quality assurance people in each of these agencies that we're looking at. And I don't think anybody had the stomach for that budgetary request to say we need new people and we need new positions due to quality assurance. This was sort of a way to reduce resistance from the top for me, was to say, you can do this by spreading some of the quality assurance so that it's not tied to a small group of people who have to do it, and then, kind of have this top-down approach. So, it kind of spread the wealth a little bit, and we made that was a conscious decision to do that, is, try to limit the resistance, get everybody involved, and so forth. From a cost standpoint, so we didn't have to hire new people to do this, so we didn't have costs associated with that. We provided them with free access to the electronic submission stuff. We put out all the technical assistance that was needed through our trainings and other places to follow the processes. So I thought all of that was great. It does take time, but you figure it's the minimum standard is one review every 6 months. So if I'm a user, I get reviewed once, and I review somebody else once. And the way we've set up this procedure, it was in some detail there, is you can essentially fulfill all 4 areas of our assessment with a single interview, because you're scoring it, then you're comparing case plans, and then if you recorded, for instance, the interview, you can assess motivational interviewing, and then, of course, supervisors only do the relationship skills once a year with the annual appraisal. So we're not, we didn't feel like it was too cumbersome to say at least focus on quality once every 6 months. And that would be my answer to that. I don't know if that's sufficient, but we felt like there were some conscious decisions we had to make.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think that's helpful and actually encouraging. If we can move on, a couple of thoughts and queries about some of the content here. And as a researcher on versions of the LSI, I was interested in the discrepancy analysis of items. And again, the detail here is tremendous. I mean, researchers love numbers and detail, and this is a combination of both. So I was interested in the companions and the attitudes sections as being the areas that you've identified, at least in West Virginia, as coming up with a lower degree of, or greater degree of discrepancy. Certainly, subjectively, I've sensed that, and I get feedback from users around the country in North America, that the attitudes component is one that can lead to discrepancies, and I hadn't focused in on so much the companion section. So that's just a comment that you may or may not have anything to add to that.
Well, I would add this. as you know, our office is responsible for validating the LSCMI, norming and doing things like this as well. I will tell you that we have produced, and it's going through some edits and things of this nature, but we'll have a validation study coming out just after the first of the year. And I will tell you that the attitude section in our state seems to be being scored low. In other words, it's not a good distribution, and the attitude section is not as explanatory as we think it should be. And I think we can reasonably tie that to the fact that there appears to be a lot of discrepancies on that domain that we're capturing in our data. So what our implication and policy implication that we're likely to recommend in this report is that DOC, DRCs, DJS accompany their LSCMI assessments with a criminal sentiment scale or an attitudinal measure so that they could get some sort of measure, really kind of a responsivity kind of measure to get at this notion of minimalization, rationalizations, and this sort of thing to complement their scoring of the LSCMI. So periodically, we're probably going to recommend that these agencies and personnel adopt an attitudinal assessment to help them in the scoring. Yeah.
Tremendous, yeah. I mean, very, very reasonable kind of response. And also, I think I heard Leanne mention, and I didn't see it in the slides, about the override and discrepancies there. Did I miss that? Is that being monitored as well?
Yes, it's being monitored, and that is one of the particular questions that we do ask is when they completed the assessment review, was there an override chosen by one or the other one that should have been, and if so, was that a discrepancy? Did they agree on that, or was there a discrepancy? We haven't seen that very much throughout the report. Most of them agree not to do an override unless it's a very particular or special case to get them into certain programming that might be necessary.
Yeah, we have emphasized the not to use overrides unless there is a truly clinical or administrative reason for doing so, just like the advice is given by the instrument. But so we are actually not seeing a whole lot of overrides being used by a DOC, for example.
Yeah, tremendous. I don't want to put you on the spot. Any idea about percentage of cases?
Well, I think I could get, I don't have the percentage, but you know what? We do have the data. But in terms of just her reviews,
on that term, I think it was like less than 2%.
Less than 2% or so. But in terms of the reviews, but we have the online system, and we check that periodically. But it's below 5% for all of our agencies.
Now that's tremendous. Then I think you're getting good instructions through your trainers to your users. I'm also curious about the impact of your process on the quality of the case management practice and scheme or protocol that's developed. I realize that may be down the road. It's a sort of an evaluation question, but do you have any sense as to what extent this quality assurance innovation is impacting on the quality of the case management?
Yeah. Not to date, because this was implemented about a year and a half ago and was fully kind of up and running in all the agencies. As we start to compile more data that will give us sufficient numbers and so forth, I think we're going to be able to start to venture out on a couple limbs. One is we're undergoing sort of a project right now that is sort of a global correctional program assessment and inventory type of approach, where we're trying to validate things, by, using some other criterion. So we're looking to see, because we're collecting information in other areas of quality, we're looking to see whether this kind of data correlates well with some of the other data we're getting on quality. So this isn't the only piece of quality that we're working on, but we're doing that. And I think at a later date we might be able to, you know, and I have to say, not a whole lot of thought's been given to it at this point, but we could and probably should develop some sort of method for seeing how these discrepancies, you know, tie into to any sort of, you know, effectiveness in actual programming or something. I think we'll have to
understood. I think that's also tremendous. It harkens back to my opening comment reference to the Harris paper in Crime and Delinquency in 2004. You might want to follow up on, you know, it along this nature is really something we need to continue to monitor and work on. I think perhaps it's time to turn things back, I guess, to, is it Jason and Karen for the poll?
Yeah, actually, I have a question. We've got some questions from participants that I'm not sure that you guys addressed. We got a question, what are the implications should a staff member not pass the certification or recertification process? Is certification tied to compensation or any disciplinary process, or do they simply get more training and coaching?
That's a great question. It's something we struggled with because, as you know, I mean, we're an external agency, so technically the employees don't work for me. So obviously we have buy-in from our agencies. And our statewide policy states that a person goes through the training, they get two, if they fail the initial test in the training, then they have one other chance to pass it. If they do not pass it, they have to retake the training. So that's our statewide policy on that. In terms of failure to comply with things like quality assurance and do those kinds of things, we report this data back to administrators. We also report what percentage of users that are registered with us in DOC, for instance, or DRCs or whatever, what percentage of users actually completed the QA process this quarter or this half of the year. And what we do, and what we're doing with that is just trying to say, look, I mean, like we have 23 day report centers across the state, for instance. Well, we might have 100% completion by all of the staff of several day report centers, but maybe we have one where there's only 60% participation among users. What we do is we communicate that to our community corrections subcommittee that oversees community corrections in the state, and they address those things at their grant reviews and other things and say, well, why was this the case? We also can follow up because we have monitors here in community corrections who can follow up and say, what happened here? Sometimes it's due to somebody leaving, some turnover or something. Sometimes it's not due to an intentional neglect. So we try to address those when we see them, and then it gets handled accordingly by the people who have oversight over those programs and the administrators and DOC and so forth. We just communicate, and then they
Here's another question. If in another state they try to recreate what you're doing, do you think it can successfully start without the centralized website and electronic form submission and data collection? And was establishing that your first step, or what were you able to accomplish before that?
Well, we did start out actually 2 years ago with paper. You know, sort of a pilot. We didn't do it statewide. We did it from some of our day report programs because it's basically a pilot. And we did it with our day report programs to see whether the forms made sense to people in the field, that they understood how to complete them, and that there was da-da-da. We made revisions based on that pilot. And we made more than one revision. We made a couple of revisions in our early stages with paper. But if I was going to do this and you're trying to do this statewide, I would recommend a pilot period. Maybe you could use paper forms at that point if you'd like, but I would also advise you that we use what's called Survey Gizmo, but you could use any sort of online sort of survey mechanism to do this. It's very easy. These forms are very easy. It's easier than almost putting them on paper, and if you can get it electronic, it's going to help your ability to assess the results and change things based on the pilot. So I'd recommend that, you know, maybe look into this. It's not that time-consuming to set this up so that it could be electronically entered. So I'd give that some heavy consideration.
We just have a couple more questions. Do any of you think that it would be beneficial to have end users provide scoring justification notes for each item so it's more transparent why an item is being scored or not?
Yes, that's very important, and we actually tell them that in a training, that if you score something a certain way, make sure you document it in the notes section so that when another user does review that, they can take your notes section into consideration, and that may be a reason why they wouldn't have scored it as a discrepancy. And a lot of what and I make sure and tell that every day during a training course, because the notes are very important, because it will, like, you know, I may just see the assessment itself and not know why something was scored a certain way, but if you put it in the notes section, then I would know. And it's also very good and very beneficial for when we do our reassessment 6 months after we do the initial LSMI intake. When somebody looks at that initial LSMI assessment, when they're doing their reassessment, it will also give them a lot of information that they can use as a collateral source before they do their reassessment interview.
I hope that answers the question. I think it answers the question.
Thank you so much to Dr. Haas and to Ms. Davidson and Dr. Wormuth. I want to thank you so much, and I want to tell everyone to have a great afternoon. This will be on our website, and if anybody has any questions that were not answered, they can email me at kmaline, K-M-A-L-I-N-E, @jrsa.org. and I'll forward them to Dr. Haas and try to get an answer for you or get you in touch with him. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Thank you.